Yeah, I'm not a teacher and trade unionist, and by the way, I'm interested, if anybody knows if U.S. labor against the war is still functioning or anything, I think we have to get, the unions and the working class really back involved on the anti-war issue, and hopefully they strikes against it. I'm wondering, I looked up a while back on the internet about, I was trying to look up what the Syrian trade unions might be doing, and I'm not sure how much trade unions even function there. And I think you learn Arabic because I couldn't find anything, I could find nothing about Syrian trade unions at all. So the Syrian trade unions, if they're there, what are they doing as part of the movement and so forth?
Is there another question, anyone? One more here, and then we'll take it.
I'm struck by the fact that back in the 80s in Latin America, particularly Central America, that sister cities were formed as part of an effort to build links and to support local grassroots organizations. For example, in Nicaragua, where I worked a lot, that was to oppose the Reagan policy at that time of arming so-called freedom fighters and opposing the U.S. policy at that time. Is there something that we can do that would be similar in building links between us, whether it be sister cities or whatever, that we can do might be effective?
There's at least one more over here.
What is your analysis between U.S. and strategic interests?
Can't hear you.
U.S. strategic interest in Syria.
Say it again.
What was my analysis on U.S. strategic interest in Syria? Is that correct? Yes.
All right, and then one more, Dan.
I just want to get a better geospatial understanding of displacement in Syria, where the majority of violence is placed and refugees.
Yeah, can you say it loud?
Sorry, trying to get a better picture of the geospatial idea, like what's going on in Syria, where people are being displaced from, and where they're fleeing to, and where they're settling.
Displacement from Syria, where are they going? Is that correct? I'll start with the easy questions, which are the last two, actually.
And if folks want to think of other questions for the next round.
And also, if we all have comments and answers to any of the questions, please do, particularly when it comes to organizing, because I haven't lived in this country for quite a while, so I really welcome input, particularly when it comes to organizing here on the ground. Syrian strategic interest. It's not oil. It's not water. It's two particular aspects. We can argue oil and water. I'm simply listing them right now because they're not the top priority. I believe the two main issues is, one, the Syrian government represents a resistance government. The Syrian government represents a resistance government. Not to say whether or not it is a resistance government, but it represents a resistance government. Okay? So it is a government that, for example, has no external debt. How dare they? It's a government that has refused a loan from the World Bank. More fundamentally, though, it is a government that has consistently fought to continue to support, both politically, financially, and militarily, the resistance movement in Lebanon. And were Syria to disengage from Hezbollah, were the Syrian government to have decided 2 years ago to say, you know what, the Golan Heights has been occupied by Israel, and that's a quiet front. Why should I support a national resistance movement in Lebanon and fund it and finance it and support it militarily and diplomatically and politically, internally in Lebanon, externally? It's too much, forget it. I'm sure it would no longer have been considered an axis of evil, and a lot of the situation would have shifted. Okay? So it's not so much that the Syrian government is anti-imperialist. I'm not going to go that far because I believe that one cannot be neoliberal and be anti-imperialist, and the Syrian government is neoliberal in its economic prospects. Particularly under Bashar al-Assad, more so than under Hafez al-Assad. There's been an increased amount of economic corruption under Bashar than under his father. But the main crime that they have committed in the eyes of the West is that they have stood by Hezbollah. and that they have stood by and created this alliance, a very loose alliance, with Iran. Now, this alliance then has been misunderstood to be a Shia resistance against the Sunni bloc in the Gulf. And this is a false representation. It's a truly false representation. Okay? One, because the Syrian government is not the Shia government. Even some that claim that it is an Alawi government, but that's actually false, because even if we're going to look within Syria, if we're going to claim that the Syrian government is being led by Alawis, which are historically an offshoot of Shia, then one would imagine that all the Alawis in Syria would have these really big bank statements and would be living the lavish lifestyle, but they're not. And if you go to the village of Hafs al-Assad, the father, the village of, his own village that is predominantly Alawis, you'll see that he's basically ignored them. Okay? So it's not this Alawi regime. It's a dictatorship whose president happens to be Alawi. But it is a secular regime. Now that's been misinterpreted because he's Alawi, consequently we can exploit the Sunni-Shia divide, and all of a sudden we can consider Alawis to be Shia, which is not at all the case. So this idea of a Shia camp is not accurate, but it has been presented as such by the Saudis and the Qataris, and propagated very much by the United States as a division. So that, I argue, is the main aspect that the West has against them, because the Syrian government hasn't fallen down far enough to the ground to acquiesce and to be a true client state like Jordan and like the Gulf. So that's one aspect. Where have the displaced and the refugees gone to? A lot of the refugees, of course, Lebanon and Syria share very porous borders. And Lebanon has been the only Syrian border that has been completely open due to various reasons, none of which have to do with love per se, more so that have to do with internal Lebanese dynamics. So there's that flow of Syrians coming in to Lebanon, very much so. Okay? There's also a flow going into Jordan, there's a larger flow going into Iraq, and there's a flow going into Turkey. Now, ironically, the Turks had already set up refugee camps before there was a refugee problem. And I had never heard of any government that already had refugee camps set up before there were refugees. Kind of speaks to their own involvement in the crisis. So that is out. Now, they've also been going to Egypt. And beyond Egypt, they've been going to Sudan. Sweden just declared a few days ago that all Syrian refugees will get asylum papers immediately. So there may be a further flood that way. What's important to point out with regards to the refugees is the first to have left went by car or went by plane or, had the economic means to travel. These others that have left have gone either hitchhiking or by car, by individual or walking, and they've typically arrived with nothing but what they have on them. So over these past 2 years, we've seen a shift in the economic demographics of the refugees themselves, from being middle class to now being the very, very poor. Now within Syria, there have been an internal displacement throughout. And interestingly, the very first to have been displaced were displaced before the uprising. And one of the areas that became the hotbed of the uprising itself, because they were displaced first by climate change and bad agricultural reform and economic policies by the government. You combine those three elements, several years of drought, bad agricultural policies, a neoliberal economy, the farmers were forced out of their lands, and those happened to then be moving into the areas that became the first to uprise. So just interestingly also to put that in context. So they've been spreading throughout the country in terms of the geopolitics of it. Now to go to the difficult questions. Where do we stand in terms of leadership to the opposition of the war here in the United States? I'm personally very happy that Answer is working with Code Pink, or at least they both co-sponsored the protest tomorrow. I understand that there have been organizational difficulties. God knows we had them during the Iraq War and during the Yugoslavia War. So it's good to see those. I'm not sure if one of the best aspects would be to create another hierarchy and organization and another leadership per se, as much as it might be better to create a decentralized format. So for example, while folks are protesting in DC and Answer and Code Pink and others are protesting, Black Workers for Justice are protesting back home in North Carolina. And that's a whole other community that's protesting at the same time, because the timing ends up being inspirational. So, and I think in this aspect, the leadership becomes important in terms of how framing is happening and how inspiration occurs, and not so much the organizational aspect itself. So I don't believe that any organization should take front and decide detailed formats. Saturday, no Sunday, no Monday, no three, no, but more of a vision. And the vision is reframing the conflict, and the vision is opposing a congressional vote, taking it to central locations, and other tactics depending on the particular communities in which you live. I mean, our tactics in North Carolina might differ from tactics in Florida, might differ from those in Michigan, so on and so forth. And I think for the anti-war movement to be truly successful, it would need to be organic and decentralized. Inspired by national leaders, but organized more locally and decentralized, I think, for it to be successful. And for it then to build coalitions that it would feel comfortable. So we in North Carolina might build a coalition with the Libertarian Party. That might not work elsewhere. It might just work in that one community. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we take that model and apply it elsewhere, but if it works within one community, maybe other communities can feel inspired to build different kinds of coalitions. Syrian trade unions, I actually beg ignorance on this. I honestly don't know. I don't know the history of trade unions in Syria, and there is one expert who happens to live a little bit south of y'all, who's Bassam Haddad, who did his doctorate specifically on the Syrian economy. Invite him up to Baltimore. Haddad, Haddad, that's his last name. His first name is Bassam. He's a very prolific writer. And he's written about the Syrian economy. I'm not sure particularly if he's written about Syrian trade unions, but if there's someone to know, he would be the one to know it. Sister cities I find to be a really interesting idea because it serves to humanize the situation. I mean, a lot of folks right now are using terms such as punish, Assad, and a slap on the wrist without recognizing bombs punish neighborhoods and not individuals, So sister cities could work on that front. I'm not sure if right now who would be the best to organize that and what would be the logistics of that. I honestly don't know, but it might be interesting to present it. I do believe, though, that what would work right now more powerfully would be a reframing of the topic, and the more that we can get that topic presented and break these binaries that have become so prevalent that I've actually come across peace activists that go, but we have to do something. And what is this something we have to do? And that becomes a really, really critical binary to break right now. If there's one binary to break right now, that would be it. So I think as much focus as we can do into framing this topic away from the good and the bad and bombing or acquiescing to murder beyond that and complicating it more. And not necessarily connecting it with our economy. I haven't found that to be very successful as outreach. Found it to be very successful for us. It gets us inflamed. They're spending $1.2 million on a Tomahawk cruise missile and closing dozens of schools in Detroit and Chicago and so on and so forth. But given that the Saudis have proposed allegedly to fund this, then the economic angle doesn't quite work. Okay? Rather, what works is this issue of priorities, this issue of how solid are we in our thinking of how can we support people by bombing them, and how do we support people through other ways? What does solidarity actually mean? What would a political settlement look like? So on and so forth. Actually getting it framed within that aspect.
Is there anybody think of other new questions? I got one here, and we'll just go through this. Okay, so you first.
I have a comment and a question. Can you hear me?
All right.
So the comment, I love the passion of your presentation. It's very sad to be here 30 years later, listening to the same crimes, just in a different part of the world. Those of us who have been working against U.S. interventions back in Central America, we're hearing the same types of atrocities, except that now it is much more complicated. Back in our years, back 30, 40 years ago, it was easy. It was the communists. And so the communists were all those folks who were fighting for better living conditions for the majority of the people in Latin America. Who was funding those wars? The U.S. government. Who was telling all the lies? U.S. government. and who was influenced by all of those lies? The people in this country who are the victims of those lies. We have the same thing here. The victims are now in the Middle East. Yes, it is a much more complicated situation, partly because the US created those monsters that are now coming out. And now they are part of the opposition, as you are explaining so well. So it's much more complicated in that sense. But the bottom line for us is, what do we do when we are inside of this monster that lives, that thrives over waging wars? In the 40 years that I have lived in this country, for those of you who are very young here, what have I seen in this country? The US has become more and more like what was known as the third world. What do I mean by that? That the very few have everything, power and everything, and the majority of us, including those of us who were sort of middle class, are now going down. So we have joined the forces of the world. They have placed us there. So let's reach out. It doesn't matter where we come from. It's the same war. And thank you so much for this presentation. My question to you, in the anti-war movement, there is a sort of debate on what actually happened with the weapons, the biological weapons. Some are saying, let's not include that in the conversation because it divides the movement. I don't think so. I think we have to come up with all of the questions that we have, because that's the only way to understand what is happening here. Some folks are saying that these biological weapons may have been used by some of those anti-Syria government forces in order to justify, to bring the US into these and give a justification to the United States for this attack that Obama now, it doesn't surprise me, is planning to do against the people in Syria. Thank you so much.
It's hard to follow that, but I guess I've been hearing, obviously, from the administration some idea of what this limited strike would be. Since you spent the past few days on Capitol Hill, what is your impression of what their plan is, and then what do you think is actually going to happen realistically, militarily, if we go ahead with the strike? What does that look like for the people of Syria? How long do you think it will last, or how long do they think it's going to last, and how long do you think it will last?
Can you remind us of, you mentioned it, but the name of the person who is working to bring all Syrians to the negotiating table for that political settlement? And I love the sister cities idea, and kind of jumping off of that, is there anything that comes to your mind as like a brainstorm of a concrete thing we can ask civilians on the ground here who are interested in doing something other than just like, let's take to the street or let's call our Congress people, but something that folks here can do to directly support some of this internal opposition, whether it's those local councils or that effort to bring people to the negotiating table?
I'd like to know what the role of Al Jazeera is in this, considering it is controlled by the Qatari government.
My favorite question of the day. As Jazeera, what is their role? First I want to say I'm very moved by your comment. Naturally, I share your passion and your horror, and perhaps had we been able to stop, This country has committed horrors every 18 months on some other community outside borders. And I would argue we've committed horrors on ourselves from the moment that this country was created on the land of the First Nations. To answer your question about chemical weapons, I'm going to list to you all the issues that have been raised, and then we can reach our own conclusions. One, we know that this attack took place 1 to 2 days after the arrival of the UN weapons inspectors. Kind of odd, I would imagine, for the Syrian regime to commit such an act with the inspectors on the ground. Just my own cynicism. There may be a lot of things, but I don't think they're that stupid. But anyway, that's my own thought. So we know that for a fact, one. Two, we know for a fact that the UN weapons inspectors that were instructed to go to Syria were given strict orders not to investigate the who and only to investigate the what. We also know that they were delayed from investigation by their own agencies and not by the Syrian government. They were delayed 5 days in their investigation, during which Secretary of State John Kerry said the Syrian government is delaying them. We also know that the Syrian government asked them to stay because the Syrian government wanted them to investigate 5 to 6 other attacks that the Syrian government claims were chemical attacks used by the rebels, and they actually asked them to stay, and the weapons inspectors left under their own direct orders. So all of these we know for a fact. None of these are disputed. We also know very clearly that the Russians have been claiming that this attack was committed by the rebels. We also know that back in May of this year, there was a UN report, and forgive me, I don't have her name offhand, but I can get you that source if you're interested, where there was a UN investigator, and I can find it in my papers, where she said that, I quote, she has strong suspicion that the rebels have sarin gas. We have numerous reports that were also published, including the New York Times, that say that and I'm using their language of the word rebel here, that the rebels are seeking to find and to acquire sarin gas. And these were published by the New York Times back in May and June. Okay? So all of these we know are undisputed. So it is a possibility that the Syrian government committed it. It is a possibility that one of the myriad of rebel opposition groups committed it. It is a possibility that a third party committed it also. They're all possibilities. One report that has come up from an Associated Press writer on the ground is he's claiming that folks are telling him that the chemical attack happened by chemical weapons given to the rebels by the Saudis that were then used incorrectly and exploded. So, they have a range of theories. Okay. My worry about going into did they not commit and do this atrocity is it would lead us to the conclusion that if they're real guilty, then we're supportive of bombing strikes. And what I've been telling folks is, let's assume that they did it. Let's assume that they individually gassed every single one of these children. Even though reports are coming out from the Syrian government that the children were not from Ghouta, that the children were actually from Aleppo, which is a coastal town quite far from the suburbs of Damascus. And just like the Russians are saying, they find it very odd that in the pictures the children don't have their parents beside them, as if they've been separated from them. So the Syrian government actually, just to make all the different scenarios clear, the Syrian government is claiming, with Aina Shaban, their minister of, I'm losing both my Arabic and English. One of the ministers in the Syrian government, with Aina Shaban, went on record a few days ago as claiming that the people that were killed by the atrocity were actually kidnapped from Aleppo by the rebels, killed, and then placed into that location. So, myriad of scenarios, all of which could be true, all of which could be false. My personal take is we have enough questions about the dossier in terms of the credibility of it. The main piece of evidence that the Secretary of State Kerry is using is that we have interceptions of a phone call. And who made those interceptions? Oh, the Israelis. Not quite a neutral body. Not quite a neutral body. And in the phone call, they didn't say, hey, Bashar, guess what I just did with your approval? It's kind of not quite clear. So we can dissect the dossier, and there have been individuals that have dissected the dossier and revealed the various loopholes and assumptions and speculations that have happened that if the dossier were presented in a U.S. court before the Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act that would allow hearsay to be presented in a court before that, it would be completely rejected as beyond circumstantial, even less than circumstantial evidence. But my worry as an organizer is if we go into did they or did they not do a chemical weapons, then we're accepting their framing of it. And the framing that I've been using is, let's assume they did it. If the objective is to deter the use of chemical weapons, and we already know that many different parties in Syria have access to it, and we already know that chemical weapons can easily be moved, they can easily be exported and imported, and they can easily be constructed, then logically speaking, a military campaign is already a failed methodology for deterrence of chemical weapons. Not even speaking ethically, I'm just speaking military. And that's been the language I've been talking with congressional reps about. And they go, yeah, you got a good point. And I go, so if that's the objective, it doesn't work. If the objective is just to punish, you won't be punishing the very ones, you'll be punishing neighborhoods. So, it's using whatever framing is being used and deconstructing it and presenting it with another alternative. The limited strike. The limited strike is not quite so limited, it's not quite so narrow. As it was first proposed by Obama and Kerry, it would have been a limited and narrow strike with very vague objectives because the objective was to punish and not to win. Kerry went on record as saying, we don't want to win this fight, we simply want to punish. And I'm not quite sure how we qualify a punishment. How do you know when a punishment has been served? Truly, as an objective, which is a check mark. How do you actually know that? And typically we know it because they haven't done it again that we claim that we want to punish them for. So even if I'm going to go with Kerry's argument, it's limited and narrow because we want to punish them, let's argue then that they do it again. Does that mean we do another limited and narrow and we go on and on and on because our credibility is at stake? Using their language, it doesn't make sense. It's open-ended, there's no sunset to it. Our loving Senator McCain actually adds the words regime change and adds the words influencing the battleground. So it's designed to weaken the military capabilities of the Syrian army. That's also quite vague in my aspect because how weak do we want it? How weak is weak enough? We don't know. I mean, just as an objective, how weaker do we want it to be? That resolution states that it's a 60-day bombing campaign with the ability of the president to renew it without congressional approval for another 30 days. So basically, it's a 60 to 90-day bombing campaign, possibly to include B-52 fighter jets, not fighter jets, big planes, B-52s, and the 5 warships that are in the Mediterranean, and the military bases that are in Jordan and Turkey, and of course we have huge military bases throughout the Gulf. 60 to 90 days. That's not limited, that's not narrow. And the objectives as discussed by the Senate are quite broad and vague and they lack indicators. The good news about that is the resolution that passed the Senate has actually increased the opposition to the military strikes because it increases the possibility of so-called boots on the ground, which has been one of the red lines by Congress. We can kill as many of them, but don't endanger any of us. That's the attitude. So I hope that answers that. Consequences, definitely civilian targets. Definitely civilians will be killed, there's no question. Definitely the humanitarian corridors and the humanitarian programs will be impacted. My take, and this is where it gets into hypothetical, is how will it impact the armed opposition? How will it impact the Syrian army? That's up for grabs. I personally expect that Al-Qaeda and Nusra would actually be empowered. It may have ramifications into Lebanon with increase of car bombs. Already, Hezbollah and Iran have gone on, well, Iran specifically has said any attack on Syria would be regarded as an attack on Iran. It's a pretty big statement. The Syrian government has said not only will we attack Israel, and I'm quoting here, not only will we attack Israel, but we will also attack Jordan and Turkey if attacks are launched from Jordan or Turkey. Okay, so these are the statements on the ground. Russia has simply said, I have a plan. But they're sending 2 warships. They're going to have 2 warships in the Mediterranean. So, again, it doesn't bode well for regional security. And I'm just talking in terms of military consequences would be huge. The third question is the individual that I brought up, his name is Ali Haidar, and for full, what do we call it, disclosure? Ali Haider is also the head of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, of which my family are members. So in case of conflict of interest, just to bring that up into the ground. Ali Haider has been appointed, he was appointed late last year, early this year, as Minister of National Reconciliation in Syria. And he went on record today as saying, I am Minister of National Reconciliation, which means that I want to reconcile Syrians killing Syrians. In that capacity, I am Minister of National Reconciliation. The moment we have an external war, the moment we are attacked by others, I become a Minister of War and Resistance. This is a direct translation. So his name is Ali Haider. I'm sorry?
Who appointed him?
الحكومة الشر الأسد. Which then raises questions as to how effective of an opposition can you be internally. But, what I personally feel thrilled about what he's saying is he's in firm commitment for negotiations. Now, the aspect is, and there's some that claim that the Syrian regime doesn't care about negotiations and they're simply using it as a bluff, okay? And like we say in Arabic, if that is the case, if it is actually a bluff, the one way to prove their bluff is to have the opposition come to the negotiating table. But for the past few months, the opposition has been saying no. And one thing about the opposition is there is no the opposition. There's no such thing as the opposition. There's no such thing as the internal opposition. And the external opposition, by the way, that's led by a man by the name of Ahmed Jabra, who you may have heard, like this man suddenly shows up in front of French and American presidents. He's the head of the Syrian National Council, was a convicted drug dealer who was appointed by the Saudis to head the Syrian National Council. So, that's the opposite. In terms of solidarity and other ways that we can take force, I think one really, really effective thing that we can do is to increase the voices and the visibility coming from the nonviolent civil resistance in Syria. However way we can increase their visibility, and there's lots of connected mechanisms. They're very popular on Facebook, but albeit in Arabic, but there could be translation, there could be ways to give them a voice. Rather than for those of us here to be speaking on their behalf, they can speak more effectively on their own behalf. There's one who's a Syrian novelist whose words have gained a lot of popularity. He's a Syrian novelist who's very adamantly anti-government, who considers the Syrian government to be fascist and dictatorial. These are his words. And he is vehemently against a U.S. military strike, because he argues that dictators bring invaders and invaders bring destruction. So more of his voices such as those can be propagated. In terms of Al Jazeera, one of my favorite topics. There's 3 Al Jazeeras now. There's Al Jazeera Arabic, there's Al Jazeera English, and lo and behold, we have Al Jazeera America. Okay, that's now gaining force, and they're under so-called separate leaderships. Al Jazeera Arabic, funded by the Qatar administration. I mean, I can talk at length about their history. I'm not sure how much time we have, but I'm just going to tell you very, very shortly. It gained a great deal of popularity in the Arab world due to its representation of the Egyptian revolution. Now, ironically, when I was in Egypt for 15 months and talking to comrades there, they said, you know what, they really exaggerated. So there was a false and inflamed representation of the Egyptian revolution by Al Jazeera. But still, we love them. We were like, oh, they're one of us. We love them. Okay. After the Egyptian revolution, things really started to change because they didn't consider anything happening in Bahrain to be a revolution. Also, for full disclosure, I grew up in Bahrain. I'm a firm believer in the Bahraini opposition. Okay. So they didn't consider the Bahraini opposition to be anything. They consider it to be a sectarian-led and funded by Iran, and they barely gave it any coverage in contrast to Egypt. Where they really crossed the line was in Libya. And Al Jazeera in Libya was spending, and this I know from folks who worked with the agency who then resigned, they were spending $1 million a day in Libya. And Qatar was the first government to recognize the Libyan National Council as the legitimate Libyan government. And they just happened to recognize them during the same time period that they signed oil contracts with the Libyans. Coincidence. So in Libya, they also fabricated a lot of information, and they had a lot of misinformation. Once they got to Syria, though, it became a full front fabrication. Now, I recognize we're all biased. I'm biased. I don't believe there's anything called an objective news agency. I consider any news agency that calls itself to be objective to be deceptive. We all have our lens through which we examine the world, so I accept bias. I reject lies and fabrication. And Al Jazeera, when it came to Syria, came up with falsehoods. They would interview people who were in Lebanon claiming they were in Syria. They would talk about conflict happening in Syria in particular neighborhoods that when we'd call our friends in those neighborhoods, they'd say, nothing's happening here. They would take images from Iraq and claim that those were in Syria. It reached such a perspective, such an inflammation, that there became a first mass flood of resignations happening in protest at that time. And now we have El Mayadeen, which is another news agency, 24-hour news agency, that was born out of some of the resignations from Al Jazeera in direct response to their problematic coverage of Syria. We see that problematic coverage now in Egypt. So Al Jazeera definitely represents the Qatari perspective. Al Arabiya represents the Saudi perspective. Okay? And it leads us to question what will actually be presented by Al Jazeera America. Al Jazeera English has fabricated less than Al Jazeera Arabic. And I would argue that Al Jazeera America will also fabricate less, but it's very, very problematic when they're funded by a government that has a very clear agenda. I mean, Voice of America I would trust more than Al Jazeera. And I mean that in full honesty. Voice of America I would trust more than Al Jazeera. Thank you again for your time. And I think, I'm not sure if there's time for any more questions or there's any more interest or... Yes? Yeah, okay.
Let's do 1, 2, 3.
First, these people have no experience in Iraq, I assume, but nevertheless, what do you think about that kind of thing? People within Syria who support, just common ordinary folk, who support, according to, that presentation, who support the bombardment of Syria by the United States.
Okay. I want to speak as a Palestinian, Arab, Syrian. A Palestinian is also Syrian. A Lebanese is also Syrian. These little states that called Palestine, these were states that were divided 100 years ago by the British and the French among themselves. It was basically a colonialist project. 100 years from now, the United States come to our part of the world to divide us further, recreate us according to the imperialist American image. Rania, what I want to say first is that when I asked you who appointed Ali Haidar, I know about Ali Haidar, and I respect him a lot. And thank you for the answer. It is Bashar al-Assad who appointed him. And he appointed, along with him, a few other dignified, honorable individuals. Ali Haidar happens to be, as far as I know, a Marxist individual, ideologically speaking, as a Marxist leaning, with an honorable history, individual honorable history. And I ask you that question because I think it is so unfair to just give in to the Western media, in particular American media, in terms of, in the campaign to dehumanize Bashar al-Assad to the point whatever Bashar said is unacceptable. We cannot even negotiate with him. I have followed this tragic story of Syria since day one, and I know that Bashar al-Assad has made many proposals to not necessarily, not progressive proposals, but he extended his hand and simply Saudi Arabia, Qatar, with Al Jazeera, and the United States and Israel were waiting. They were just waiting to leap on Syria and destroy Syria. This has been a long-term plan for Israel and the United States and Turkey and the Qatarites and the Saudis. They've been waiting for that moment. When they went into Libya and destroyed Libya, the question was, what's next? And it was clear that it was Syria. What I want to say is that, here's what I want to say, there are other dimensions to this, what's happening in Syria. There is the oil factor. There's a huge oil factor. The oil and the natural gas that was discovered along the coast of greater Syria, Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, which Israel has been stealing, and the world says nothing. Israel has stolen Palestine and now, legitimately, according to colonialist standards, steals the oil of Palestine while Palestinians are still in refugee camps many Palestinian refugee camps, are just watching Israel steal more and more, and no one says anything about it. I believe that the United States' main goal in this war is that oil. The United States and Israel and Turkey and the Saudis and Qatar do not want a movement like Hezbollah, an honorable, dignified resistance movement, a movement that can be compared to many national liberation movements in the world, honorable ones that we have supported, yet we don't listen to Hezbollah. Because Hezbollah has a beard, and Hezbollah has a turban, and we never hear. But if you guys hear, by the way, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Christian Palestinian, non-believer. And I want you to know, you guys miss a lot when you don't hear Hassan Nasrallah speak. Probably the greatest, most entertaining revolutionary in the world is Hassan Nasrallah, and you never hear him. And also, he's a man who tells the truth about everything, but it's the truth together with the gun, people. And Israel has learned the lesson. In 2006, Israel tried to destroy the only pocket of resistance, genuine pocket of resistance in the Arab world, in our area, that is promising a resistance movement, and I'm talking about Hezbollah, is respected by everybody. In the old times, my mother, who's an illiterate, used to see Abdul Nasser's picture and she'd say, may God preserve you. Now, the same thing is happening to where Hassan Nasrallah. And the US and Israel will not allow this resistance movement to grow further. An anti-colonialist resistance movement, a movement that promises victory because it has defeated the Israelis several times. And the Arab people, all over the Arab people, are starting to look toward that resistance movement, supported by that demonized regime of Syria and Iran. And it is that bloc, that resistance bloc, that can stop the US and Britain and Turkey and all these colonialist, traditional colonialist powers from taking over the oil and the natural gas that is coming out of the coastal area. And I think that's an important fact. These are important connections to me. Personally, I want to the record, like to quote Rania, I do not believe there is a revolution in Syria. With all honesty, with all responsibility, I do not believe there is a revolution in Syria. If there was a revolution, we would have heard about it. We would have heard the revolutionary vision for Syria and the Arab world and the whole area there. We never hear any vision. Who has a vision? There are few individuals, respectable people that you can respect, but they do not carry any weight in Syria. Most of the Syrian people, like most of the Arab people who have still Arab blood in them, they look toward Syria as part of the resistance bloc in our part of the world. Thank you.
I'm sorry, there's one question I missed over here, and I want to cut it there because we're going to run really late otherwise. And I apologize to anyone who else had their hand up. We just have to stop somewhere, but I'm sure Rania will stick around and answer questions on an individual level. There's one hand over here I wanted to grab.
It's actually not a question, it's more connecting that comment to the strategic interest of Syria. And I would say would it not be possible to actually go beyond saying that it's the link between the regime in Syria and Hezbollah and more to do with securing that last border of Israel? Because Egypt is now secure. Hezbollah and, well, the Lebanese border was secured in 2006, and now the last fighting border for Israel to secure would be the Syrian border once and for all, to get rid of that and destabilize it. Now, in terms of that, links back to the consequences of what this strike might be. And I'm just astounded at how the leadership of this country is unable to learn from its history, because in 1998 there was a US missile strike in Sudan on a chemical so-called factory in Khartoum, and for full disclosure, I am from Sudan. Of course, it was to cover the 98 crisis here, domestically, of the Clinton-Monica Lewinsky debacle, for lack of better terminology. And it backfired immensely on the image of the United States, because if in fact
there was chemical weapons, and you're going to bomb the chemical weapons, then surely the chemical weapons will then explode and affect the civilians with those chemical weapons that you are going to bomb. So that was one of the main facts that just turned the public, the international community, the international arena at large against the United States, and in turn supported Sudan, which was internationally isolated. And then Sudan started getting international backing, and oh, look, poor Sudan. Are they not learning from anything they've done in history? That's all.
I must beg an apology to the very first person that asked me the question in the second round. Who was that very first person? About support from within Syria and about the nonviolent civil resistance movement, right?
Right, so I asked you about the nonviolence and also the domestic pressure Saudi Arabia is placing in the U.S.
I just had difficulty reading my own handwriting. Okay, so yes, there is civil resistance movements happening in different fronts. There is a nonviolent opposition in Syria. It's really hard for me to, it's not organized. There's not one body that you can go to, the Coalition for Nonviolent Opposition. It's decentralized, it's localized, it takes a variety of forms, from writing to organizing to strikes to humanitarian work to protesting to raising awareness, all these forms. There is one, if you Google map of nonviolent opposition in Syria, there was a map that was recently released just earlier this week that shows the flood of it. Okay, so it does exist. That there is some. Now, whether it can count as a revolution or not a revolution, I think depends on our own personal definition of revolution. We've been arguing whether Egypt was a revolution or uprising, and I don't want to get into the semantics of that. But there is a movement within Syria to, in one way or another, resist what is happening to them, be it resistance against the armed terrorist, or be it resistance against the regime, or be it resistance to simply survive. There's a whole range of that. So there is that. As for individuals within Syria who would say, come bomb us, there was a letter also, Google Vijay Prashad, V-I-J-A-Y, Prashad, P-R-A-S-H-A-D. He wrote a letter to a Syrian friend who was claiming that opposing the bombing means supporting the regime. It's a very interesting letter because it contextualized the history. My take on this as an Arab, which is not my take as an American. As an Arab, I tend to be very harsh to my own brethren. And I would regard a Syrian within Syria who calls for the bombing of his country to be driven to desperation and to exhaustion. And when I talk to my friends in Syria and I tell them I'm terrified about the bombing, what they have told me in response was, well, we've been dying every day. So we might as well die one big death. It could stem out of that sense of desperation, just get it over with. It could stem out of that sense of desperation and opposition to the government, that there may be a sliver of hope and the naivete would carry them. I can excuse that. What I personally, as an Arab, cannot excuse is any Arab outside of Syria calling for the bombing, and there's only one word for that, and that's treason. Now, for here, those of us who are not Arab who think that a bombing is in support, then I would argue that's historical naivete and decontextualization and so on and so forth. And there's so much information that we can present as to the history of U.S. bombing, as to the very logic. You cannot bomb me and show me your love. Show me your love in other ways and not with a B-52. I don't really feel it in a B-52. In terms of Saudi Arabia, it's been lobbying in several ways. It's lobbying primarily right now by bankrolling this possible war, and I prefer to call it a war rather than a military strike. Now, they're not, offering to bankroll it because they want to, period. It's a good investment on their part financially to do so, because one of the direct consequences of a war on Syria will be a hike up in energy prices. Gasoline prices increase. Who are the first beneficiaries? The people who sell oil. And the gas prices are expected to increase so much more than whatever the war itself could cost. So it would be a good financial investment on the part of the Saudis. Now, I'm not arguing that they're doing it because of a financial investment. They're doing it out of their own ideological interest to reshape the region in a way that suits themselves more. And forgive me, when I refer to Saudis, I specifically refer to a few princes within that monarchy, and not the country or the people. As for Congress, one thing I do want to say about Congress is don't feel restricted to only call your representative in your district. Call your representative of your state. And here you can call it because you are speaking as an individual from that state when you call, because this is an issue that's so much bigger than your district that you can really claim every representative from your state as your representative. I mean, I've been claiming every North Carolinian as my representative, and they've opened their doors and they've sat with me and they've listened to my phone calls and they've taken that note. You know, I'm also claiming that I'm representing North Carolinian coalition when I'm actually representing the triangle-based coalitions, but nevertheless. So really harass Congress on that front, and there is a possibility, and particularly for Democrats. The Republicans are leaning much more toward a no vote. The Democrats are leaning much more toward a yes vote. And so I actually argue that it's political suicide for Democrats to vote yes, because they could actually lose the vote in the next election because of this. Okay, I think I've answered that question. In terms of Ali Haidar, just one thing to say about Ali, word that I just said. He didn't lose his son. He didn't walk away one day and get lost. His son, Ismail Ali Haidar, was actually killed in a direct attack by one of the rebel groups. And Ali Haidar responded to the assassination of his son by saying, we respond with nonviolence. And we firmly believe in a political settlement. And I have a great deal of respect for men like that. My position is that in the negotiation, the Syrian government should be present. Now, there are other comrades, other intellectuals that I have a great deal of respect for, such as Asad Abu Khalil, who you might follow his blog on Angry Arab, who argues, no, the Syrian government should not be present at the negotiating table. So you will find this difference in perspective amongst the same groups. Okay, so I just want to put that out into the table. I also just want to say one thing as an Arab, that were it not for the fertile ground in the Arab world, the United States would not have been able to do what it's doing to us, and we need to take responsibility for that. And were it not for the fertile ground in the United States itself, the U.S. administration would not also be able to take advantage of that in a myriad of ways. The Tea Party would not have been created in the successful form that it was created were it not for our own very, very successful turf battles within the left. So let's also recognize that we're not only passive victims, we also should take some kind of responsibility for what's been placed upon us as Arabs, as Americans, as leftists, as peace activists. There is that responsibility. With regards to the Golan Heights is the most secure border with Israel. It's the most secure border with Israel. More secure than the Egyptian-Israeli border, definitely more secure than the Lebanese-Israeli border. I would argue, if I'm going to wear the ugly Zionist apartheid hat, that Israel has a possibility to lose in this war because it would open the Golan Heights. Because with chaos in Syria, it would open the Golan Heights to become a front. Because it has not been a front in any way, shape, or form, and the Syrian government has only fought Israel via Lebanon and not fought Israel via Syria. So that would be
correct. I don't mean by border as in it's an unsecure border. I mean that is the only neighboring state to Israel that is still posing a threat to Israel.
Causing a threat through Hezbollah.
Of course, but it is the regime. It is the only neighbor still functioning as a full country.
True.
As opposed to a state within a state, as opposed to just an opposition.
Yes,
That's what I mean.
Yes, on that sense, very much so. Very much so. So with that, I'm here. You can continue to talk to me for as long as Zane has the ability to drive me back to DC. So thank you all for your time.